Hey guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here. I'm here to talk to you about a graphic novel. This is actually my second attempt at this video because the first video, it just wasn't very good. So here I am for round two of talking to you about Superman, Kryptonite, Nevermore. This collects some issues of Superman from the 1970s, Superman issues 233 through 242, except for issue 239. It skips over 239, but it collects everything else in between there. On the back of the book, if you happen to see this at your comic book store, on the back of the book it says this volume contains Superman 233 through 237 and 240 through 242. It doesn't mention anything about 238. It says that it doesn't collect that on the back of the book, but it does collect that. It is in this book. However, 238, this whole book is basically one kind of long-running storyline. Almost all of this run by Denny O'Neil and Curt Swan is one continuous storyline. 238 is kind of an interlude that has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the storyline going on through this whole book, so maybe that's why they didn't mention it on the back of the book, but that issue is collected here. So if you're curious about that, it is here. That's a little bit of a mistake on the back of the book. So now I should go ahead and say this book is written by Denny O'Neil and drawn by Curt Swan, as I already said. And Denny O'Neil, at the time that he wrote this, he was a young writer at DC. He had already done a couple of revamps of some existing characters at DC. He fundamentally changed Green Lantern and Green Arrow. He very well-known revamp for those characters that people are still talking about to this very day. And he also, him and Neal Adams, they worked on the Green Lantern Green Arrow run together. And then him and Neal Adams also kind of tweaked Batman and kind of made him a little bit less campy, kind of sort of steered him in the direction that later Frank Miller would take him down even further, made him a little bit darker than he was in the 60s, but not quite as dark as Frank Miller took him. And so, as he mentions, Denny O'Neil, he wrote the afterword in this book, as he mentions, it seems like he was the perfect choice to then revamp Superman. And his choice to revamp Superman, because with all of those revamps, he also did a revamp on Wonder Woman that I haven't read. With all of these revamps, he did something pretty fundamentally huge. He shook things up in a certain way. Now, with the Green Lantern Green Arrow run, I pretty much really enjoy that run for the most part. There were things about it I thought didn't work very well. And then I really loved what he did on Batman. I've really loved all that stuff. His Wonder Woman run, a lot of people don't really like what he did there. Even he has gone back and said that his run on Wonder Woman, not what it should have been. He regrets a lot of what he did on that title. I'm going to go ahead and say it's not as good as his Green Lantern Green Arrow or his Batman run, largely because of the approach that he took to Superman. When he decided he was going to revamp Superman, his thought was, how can you write stories about a character, how can you write interesting stories about a character and make the audience feel for this character when all he has to do is listen hard and he can destroy a galaxy. Those were his words, listen hard and destroy a galaxy. And I don't really agree with that sentiment. Kurt Busiek is another writer. He said once, the simple thing to do, don't write stories where the solution to the conflict is Superman listening hard so that he can destroy a galaxy. Actually, Kurt Busiek's response, his said something about don't write stories that involve Superman throwing a mountain or something like that. Basically, what he's saying is don't write stories where his superpowers are what helps him get through the conflict. There are many different kinds of stories that you can do where even though Superman is the most powerful being on the entire planet, that's still not going to help him in whatever conflict he's going through in that issue. And I feel like that's something that young Denny O'Neil really should have taken to heart before he started this run, because the whole thing is basically his attempt to kind of depower Superman a little bit. And as he mentions in the afterword, after 9 issues, he was basically finished with Superman. He didn't really feel like he was working very well on that title. So after he leaves, the very next issue after his run sees Superman juggling planets once again. He said something about the cover right after he left, and I haven't looked at that cover. And in fact, just for the purposes of this review, that has nothing to do with this. But I'm just saying, if you're wanting to get this book because you feel like it's going to be a huge milestone in the life of Superman, it's a big Superman moment, this is a huge era, not so much, because after these 9 issues, whoever followed Denny O'Neil didn't really follow up this stuff where Superman is slightly depowered. They kind of just ignored all of this stuff. So it's not so much a well-known revamp like the Green Lantern Green Arrow stuff or even the Batman stuff he did. Or I would even say, and I haven't read it, but I would even say that Denny O'Neil's Wonder Woman stuff is probably more well remembered than his Superman stuff here, because this isn't really followed up at all. Whoever came after him basically just wanted to do their own thing. So anyway, the basic premise is, in the very first issue here, there's some scientists who are doing an experiment with kryptonite, trying to create free, renewable energy for the entire planet. And then the experiment goes wrong, but all of the kryptonite on the entire planet is rendered inert. No more kryptonite. And that's probably the most interesting thing that O'Neil does here, because he mentions that kryptonite had become a crutch for writers. It's like, well, what do we do? How do we make this story interesting? How do we add some conflict here? I know, let's throw some kryptonite in there. And like Denny O'Neil said, that had become a crutch. And I agree with that. It's just everything else Denny O'Neil said about this run that I disagreed with. And so, in the very beginning, we have all the kryptonite on Earth is now completely useless. And then, starting in that issue, we see that there is this creature made out of sand, and he is basically... we find out at the end of this run that he is an interdimensional being from another reality called Quarm. And I will say, the reveal of where this false Superman came from, because this creature made out of sand is a duplicate of Superman, the reveal of where this false Superman came from is not written very well. If you've heard me talk about on this channel many times before, Chekhov's gun, which basically means if you are going to shoot a gun in Act 3 of your story, you need to introduce that gun in Act 1. And that basically just means don't pull stuff out of nowhere and throw it into your story. Your audience is going to feel cheated when you do that. And I feel like that happens here, because this guy, I Ching, who is this extremely racist stereotype of the wise Asian master who is going to train the young white hero, kind of like the Karate Kid, but a little bit more racially insensitive. I Ching, he just out of nowhere says, yeah, this false Superman, he comes from a dimension called Quarm. And it just comes out of nowhere. I really feel like the idea that there's this interdimensional being that comes from this world called Quarm, that could have worked if you played with it a little more, if you kind of seeded it earlier in the run so that it doesn't feel like you're just pulling something from out of nowhere to explain where this other Superman came from. Like I said, there's 9 issues collected here, but one of the issues, issue 238, has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of it. It has nothing to do with any of these stories, so this entire 8-issue run, the through line is this false Superman, where Superman might be trying to vacate an island where a volcano is about to erupt, and then a Superman made out of sand will fly by, and then Superman will momentarily feel weaker. And it's really weird to me that Denny O'Neil talks about how much of a crutch Kryptonite was, but then in the same issue where he gets rid of all the Kryptonite, he then creates this other crutch where it's equally depowering to Superman. In the same way that Kryptonite would momentarily weaken Superman, this Superman made out of sand basically has the exact same effect on Superman. I thought that was very strange, very odd, but it's all part of this ongoing story where we find out that this Superman made out of sand, he is from a dimension called Quarm, and eventually he realizes that he wants to live on Earth and he wants to fight crime, and he realizes there cannot be 2 Supermen on this world, and that also kind of comes very late in the game. This is all of the character development for the Quarmian Superman comes very late. His desire to fight crime on Earth, and him thinking that the 2 Supermen, this town ain't big enough for the 2 of them, as John Wayne would say, all of that comes very late, like in the last issue. Yeah, I feel like this book would have worked a lot better if we could have been seeing the Quarmian Superman slowly come to the realization that, like the real Superman, he wants to fight crime, he wants to be a noble hero, and he also realizes that the 2 of them cannot coexist together. All of that would have worked a lot better if they had been seeding it much earlier in the run. For the first half of this run, the Quarmian Superman is maybe in 1 page per story. He's barely even a footnote in the first few issues, and that's really the only thing that keeps those earlier issues collected here. And then in the later issues, he's much more of a presence. But when you're reading the first few issues, you may be saying, I don't really understand what's going on here. Give it a few more issues, and then it'll all kind of start to come together. But the story is okay. It's not a bad story. I do feel like it could have been written a little better. Some stuff, like I said, where it kind of breaks Chekhov's gun. I really feel like it could have been written a little bit better. I feel like some of the characterization, if it had been explored a little more in the earlier parts of this run, that could have been a little bit better. It's not terrible, but I feel like the reason that it's not sticking with me as much, where it's not as good to me, is because of two reasons. One, I had heard a lot of people really hype up this story before, really talk about how incredible it was, and when I read it, I just wasn't feeling it. I wasn't feeling that level of "this is awesome" that I heard other people say about this run. And two, I think part of the reason it's not really working for me is because I know in the back of my mind that this era of this new version of Superman doesn't last very long. And as soon as O'Neill leaves, everything is back to status quo. And that shouldn't matter to me. The fact that a story attempts to subvert the status quo and that doesn't really work after that writer leaves, that shouldn't affect my enjoyment of that story. But it did here, and I really don't know why. The artwork is very good. Kurt Swan is a very fantastic artist. I really loved everything that he did here. And I feel like Denny O'Neill is doing the best with what he's doing. He has an idea. I'm going to depower Superman a little bit to make it easier to write stories about him. I don't agree with that sentiment that he comes up with, but based on that sentiment, I feel like Denny O'Neill does pretty good with what he's trying to do. Like I said, there's some writing here that could have been improved a little bit, but I do know for a fact that in later years, Denny O'Neill was a better writer. He did some stuff in the about 10 to 15 years after this that is much, much better than this. And even some of the stuff he was doing around this time, I think, worked a little bit better in premise than this does. I would give this maybe a 6 out of 10 if I had to give it a number review. I don't like doing numerical ratings because I don't usually do it and I'm not really good at it. But if I had to give this a rating, I would say 6 out of 10. It's not the worst Superman story ever, but it doesn't work for me like some of the other stuff by Denny O'Neill. So that's all I have to say about Superman Kryptonite Nevermore. So I hope that you guys liked this review. If you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys later in the week with another kind of video. So until then, I'll catch you later. Have a good one.